Welcome back, historians. Today we're going to be taking a look at two specific polises from ancient Greece, Sparta and Athens. And you might have a little bit of background knowledge about the two of these because they're two of the most well-known. Now, they were very, very different in a lot of ways. We've talked about how polises were each like their own little independent countries, and they might have shared some things like language or religion, but for the most part, they had very different lifestyles. That's certainly true of life in Athens and Sparta. And it's important because they had very different governments. And the Athenian form of government, democracy, strongly influenced later forms of democracy, including our own. Before we get into the details about these two specific city-states, though, or polises, let's look at some of the different forms of government. No matter what polis you lived in ancient Greece, there was always going to be a struggle for power and resources. And this led to several different forms of governments kind of springing up in ancient Athens, or not just Athens, but all of the city-states. The first is one we're pretty familiar with, a monarchy. The earliest Greek polises were controlled by monarchs or hereditary kings. So when we think monarchy, we're going to put on our crown. Say, monarchy with our crowns. This is very similar to what we've seen before, whether it's in Egypt or Mesopotamia or even in China where we had a king in charge. But we move on from that. Now, I want you to draw a little arrow between the crown and that arm to show that this is a next step, a tyranny. Some tyrants or powerful and popular military leaders with the support of the citizens overthrew the kings in ancient Greece, depending on the polis. So some polises were ruled by tyranny. Now, we're going to do, when we say tyranny, we're going to do a nice strong arm to remind us that tyrants were powerful, strong leaders. But even though they ruled by force, they had to have an army. And so they wanted to make sure that they kept their army, the common people, happy. And so they were very popular. Make sure you circle and star that word popular. Today, when we think of a tyrant, we think of, oh, some evil, terrible leader. But in ancient Greece, they were very, very popular with the common people. One group that was not popular with the common people were the oligarchs. In some states, a few wealthy people held power over the entire polis. So when we think of an oligarchy, we're going to take our hands and grab all the power with just a few fingers. An oligarchy. So all the wealth, all the power is being held by just a few people. So this is a step up from a monarchy. The oligarchs said, hey, why does that guy get all of it? We're wealthy, we're educated, we can seize the power too. But we still only have just a few people holding all of that power. Sparta, we're going to see, was an oligarchy. We also, next in the process, see a democracy. By about 330 BC, some city-states were democracies, where all citizens were involved in ruling the government. So when we think of a democracy, we're going to do a count of all the people voting. We're going to say democracy, and we're counting up all the people that are voting for a particular issue. So remember, though, in ancient Greece, citizens were usually only a small group of people still. So we had no women, no foreigners, no slaves. But as we go from just a little bit, only one person having power, to then one person having power with the support of people, then a few, then a lot. So it gets bigger as we go. We still don't have everyone having power, but we have more than just one person. So let's practice those hand motions one more time. We have a monarchy, ruled by a king, a tyranny, ruled by a strong military leader or tyrant, an oligarchy, ruled by just a few, or democracy, ruled by the people, okay, ruled by the citizens. Now, Sparta was an oligarchy. And now I like this picture of an oligarchy because you've got the few wealthy people down up here kind of looking down at all the common people. and it invaded neighboring city-states and enslaved the local people. Up to two-thirds of the population of Sparta were helots, or slaves. Now, if we look at Sparta, notice it's inland here. Okay, it's not by the ocean, it's surrounded by mountains. So this is a great example of them wanting to get resources from other places. Now, I always remember this vocabulary word for helots or slaves because life was very, very tough for a slave in ancient Sparta. It was kind of a living hell. So that's an easy way to remember, kind of a little PG way, to remember that vocabulary word, helots. Now, around 650 BC, the helots rebelled, and they said, "You are treating us too badly." Now, instead of changing their behavior, the Spartan citizens crushed the rebellion and made Sparta a military society. They said, "We can't trust you to not rebel again, so now slaves get no weapons, and we are going to have a strong society with a powerful army to make sure nobody rebels." So now your life would be a little bit different if you were a boy or a girl in Sparta. If you were a boy and you were born unhealthy, you'd be left outside the city as a baby to die. They'd take you up into the mountains and they'd just leave you there. Sorry, had to go answer the door. Anyways, they would just leave the babies up on a hill, and if you didn't survive, it was obviously the will of the gods. So it was real harsh. Today, if you are a baby born with special needs or not very sick, or born very sick rather, we do everything we can to save you. That was not the case in ancient Sparta. It gets worse. At age 7, you left home to go to military school. So imagine what you were doing at age 7, playing Pokemon, maybe, watching TV. You probably still have a stuffed animal you sleep with. No shame in that. I still have a teddy bear. But you did not get shipped off to military school. But in Sparta, at age 7, that's exactly what happened. And they were treated very harshly. They were not given very much food. They were given not very warm clothes, even though they lived up in the mountains. They were given just the bare basics, and they were beaten sometimes. And it was all to create a tough, hard soldier who could live in any conditions. Because men were required to stay in the military until the age of 60. Okay? So life was very, very tough for a Spartan, and it created these strong warriors. That's why today, when we think of something like the Spartan race, maybe you've seen that obstacle course, it's something that is very, very tough. Now, if you were a girl in ancient Sparta, you might like this life a little bit more, because girls had many more rights than most women in the ancient world did. For example, girls, we could own property, train in sports, and run our own households. Our men were off training for the military a lot of times or off battling in war, so it was up to us to be protectors of the household and run everything. We had a lot of power in Sparta because the men were never home. They were off being soldiers. So women were in control of slaves, they were trained in weapons, they were trained to run fast. But the main goal of doing all of these things for Sparta was for women to raise strong, brave Spartan soldiers. In fact, the role of the Spartan mother was so honored that there were only 2 groups of people in Sparta that were given headstones when they died that actually had their name on them. Most people were just buried without a headstone with their name on them. The 2 groups of people who got headstones with their names on them were soldiers who died in battle and women who died in childbirth, providing more soldiers for Sparta. So it was a little bit, not too shabby to be a woman in ancient Sparta, but there really wasn't a whole lot of fun, not a whole lot of luxury. It was a very tough life. If you wanted something a little bit more luxurious, you had to go to Athens. Now in Athens, they go through this kind of cycle of changing their government several times. Tension between rich citizens and poor farmers led to many stresses and tensions and changes of government. There's several leaders that will kind of walk through that change of government, and we're going to read some about these in class. The first one, Solon, was an oligarch. He was a respected, wealthy merchant who the nobles turned to for leadership. And I'm going to put an O for oligarch right here. Okay? He was somebody that the nobles said, hey, we know that the common people are unhappy. Help us figure out a way. He ended the farmers' debts and opened the assembly to all citizens. Before Solon came along, you could not participate in government at all if you were not rich. So he started to open that up. Then we see Pisistratus, who is a tyrant, right? A T for tyrant there, who took over the government and spread citizenship to all men, even if you didn't own land. So before Pisistratus, you had to own land to be a citizen, and he said, let's get rid of that. And then we have Cleisthenes, democracy. Now we call him the father of democracy. So I have a hand motion for you. I want you to do little C hands, they look like little Lego hands. And then we're going to say Cleisthenes, and you can't see it, but I'm pointing to my knees. So C and then knees. We're going to say Cleisthenes, Cleisthenes, the father, with a little baby, of democracy. One more time. Cleisthenes, Cleisthenes, the father of democracy. So he's considered the father of democracy. Go figure. He made the assembly where all citizens gathered together, the major governing body, and created a council of 500 citizens whose members were chosen randomly to make important decisions. So as time passes in Athens, more and more people still get the right to vote and participate in government. Not women, not slaves, not kids. Sorry, guys. But more than just that few oligarchs. So now that we've talked about government a little bit, let's talk about what life would be like for a common person in Athens. Again, we're going to divide it boys versus girls here, because life would be very different depending on where you were. If you were a wealthy boy, you went to school to improve both body and mind. The Athenians believed in a body-mind balance, whereas Spartans were all about military, military, military. The Athenians also studied poetry and science and all sorts of things, as well as military. Wealthy boys, at least in early Athens, were allowed to become soldiers and government officials, while poor boys usually became farmers. Now, if you were a girl or a female in ancient Athens, your life was not going to be as free as it was in Sparta. For example, you could only be educated at home by your mothers, and you were taught spinning, weaving, and other household chores. Your role in ancient Sparta, ladies, was to run the household, not to do anything else, not to use weapons, not to hold property, nothing. You weren't even allowed to leave the house if you were a wealthy Athenian woman, except for on special occasions. You were hidden away. Okay, so you might go with servants to visit families and all that, but you wouldn't go to the temple alone. You wouldn't go to the market alone unless you were maybe a servant. And you also could not own property or have any legal rights. Ladies, if we lived in ancient Athens, we would be considered the property of our fathers, and then when we got married, our husbands. And if our husbands died, well, it would be our oldest son or our oldest male relative. So life was pretty good in Athens if you were a boy. If you were a girl, you might have beautiful, luxurious things and, you know, have more access to arts and beautiful clothes and all that. But life would be very, very limiting in certain ways as well. Now, I want you to write in one more thing right at the bottom of your notes, and I'll show you where here. Let me get my notes packet. We are going to write it in right down here below boys and girls in Athens. It's important for us to know that Athens had a strong navy, while Sparta had a strong army. Now, if we look at a map, this makes sense, because here's Athens right by the ocean. So they, of course, were going to be able to build some boats, whereas Sparta was more inland. They didn't really have access to the ocean. They were several, I believe, about 60 miles away, so it makes it much harder to build boats and use them effectively. It's important to know these two because we're going to see them come into conflict soon, and their different strengths and weaknesses are going to determine how that conflict ends. So you might, if I were you and if I was a good artist, I might draw a little boat below where I wrote Athens. And then I might draw maybe a sword or something else where under Sparta. It's up to you. All right, guys, make sure you're taking good notes and we'll talk soon.